Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Five for Breakfast. We're now in our 22nd episode of 2026. I'm still riding high from the amazing Fiber Connect 2026 that we held in Orlando a couple weeks ago. I've never seen our industries more excited and the quality of discussions more thoughtful and purposeful. And we're going to be back in Nashville next year, June 13th to 16th for Fiber Connect 2027. The exhibit hall for 2027 is already sold out, but we'll be opening up an AI and quantum infrastructure pavilion as we're seeing fiber moving from connecting communities to the internet to becoming the critical infrastructure of the future. And with Fiber Connect 2026 in our rear view, our regional Fiber Connect workshops will pick back up with our next event in Bozeman, Montana on Tuesday, July 21st. Registration for Bozeman is already well ahead of any record we've had in the past. So if you want to go, you better register as soon as possible on our website. Last week I had the privilege to tour the largest fiber manufacturing facility in the world just outside of Charlotte. It's exciting to see such high demand for fiber and how our industry is stepping up to provide more fiber and cabling capacity. I was also up in DC last week meeting with the White House on AI, and I also had an opportunity to meet with some of the largest AI hyperscalers. The AI and quantum investment cycle is dovetailing perfectly into the back end of our current fiber broadband investment cycle, providing significant opportunity for our members for years to come. And the Fiber Broadband Association is heavily focused on ensuring that our members are well positioned to participate in these historic infrastructure investments. Last week on Five for Breakfast, our guest was FBA Strategic Research Partner, Mike Render, principal at RVA, who shared with us his later consumer research on fiber's role in a disruptive era, AI, video proliferation, and counter-urbanization. The fiber industry has been focused on build faster, build farther, connect more people. But Mike's latest research finds that our industry is entering a period where long-term competitiveness depends less on pure expansion and more on how operators navigate a much more complex mix of technology shifts, consumer behavior, and economic uncertainty. So if you missed last week's session, you can go to our website and watch the replay. Today on Five for Breakfast, our guest is our good friend Jeff Heynen, the Vice President of Broadband Access and Networking at Dell'Oro Group, discuss his latest research on broadband access and home networking forecasts. Jeff joined Dell'Oro in 2018 as responsible for broadband access and home networking, fixed wireless access and CPE, cable out supply, and virtual BNG market research. With nearly 25 years of industry experience, Jeff is recognized as an expert in broadband technologies and network architecture trends. He's expanded the scope of broadband access and home networking areas to encompass fixed wireless CPE, cable DAA platforms, as well as virtual and disaggregated BNGs. Jeff has a BA in International Studies from Whittier College and a concentration in economics with an MA in German and European Studies in Georgetown. With all that, I never knew, Jeff, that you are German. So, how's your German these days?
It's still pretty fluent, as much as I can talk to anybody that still speaks German. But yeah, it's a little rusty at first, but I can still navigate it.
Well, welcome, Jeff. And for audience, please type in your questions as we go, and we'll get those in discussion. So I will turn it over to Jeff.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Gary. And it was great to catch up with you in Orlando. And thanks again for hosting such a really important event. It's a must attend event for me, and I know a bunch of other analysts as well. So it's always a great opportunity to catch up with operators and members there. So with that said, I wanted to share first as we start here, just kind of an overview of some of the trends and things that we're hearing now, just in terms of our discussions with operators at the show and prior to the show and ongoing discussions with vendors. I'm right in the midst of publishing my Q1 numbers, which has some interesting changes. I think the biggest thing for me is the fact that 50 gig PON is now being reported by some of the Chinese suppliers And we knew that was going to happen this year. I think some of the early numbers that we're seeing are about in line with what the operators there in China have promised to purchase this year. So look for those updates coming up, and then obviously that will have an important impact on our forecasts. But one of the important things I think that it keeps coming up again and again is that latency, really end-to-end latency, has become a very important dynamic and important issue to tackle. And look, if you're an operator and you're staring down the potential of Amazon Leo or Starlink, you know that your advantage, not only as a terrestrial provider, is going to be bandwidth, but it's also going to be latency. And the one thing, in all this speculation about AI and what the impact is going to be on traffic demands and growth, the one clear thing that everybody knows about it is that reduced latency from end to end will be a critical determinant of the quality of experience that your users face. I mean, it's very easy to see, right? We're now in this where you're typing with a chatbot in Claude or ChatGPT, but that's going to go verbal quickly, and you're going to expect a real-time conversation with that chatbot and your instantaneous results. And the only way to get that isn't through additional bandwidth, it's through reduced latency. And so all the things that we hear, it's going to bring more return on investment in terms of improved quality of experience. It's going to be a way as a broadband provider for you to differentiate your network from somebody else. And we're seeing operators like Comcast and Charter and AT&T and others all now starting to say, look, quality of experience depends entirely not on the bandwidth we provide necessarily or the billboard speeds, but also on your quality of experience with the applications that you use. So all these PON technology upgrades that I've been tracking for years, they're not necessarily just about purchasing the latest in terms of how much billboard or how much bandwidth and capacity you're going to get out of that purchase, but also how much reduction in latency are you going to get? And then also, how is that going to reinforce your advantage in providing symmetrical speeds? Because the upstream is going to be just as critical as downstream bandwidth going forward. And I think every operator recognizes that, as do cable operators who continue to try and rectify that shortcoming in the DOCSIS network. So how do we see that translated into capital expenditures on a large-scale basis, right? Operators now, there's a lot of uncertainty, of course, about the impact of AI and AI inferencing and large language model training. What is that going to do to their networks? How do they account for that? And the one thing that all of these operators are trying to adjust for is to reduce the overall capital intensity. In other words, reducing their overall CapEx on equipment and focusing on stable spending and looking for increased revenue through fiber ARPU growth. And then also, again, and I think maybe I didn't get a chance to catch Mike Render's presentation last week, but there's kind of a move away from just pure network expansion towards some of these individual capacity upgrades within the existing serving areas, and also now spending on software to, again, improve latency, to improve the performance of the throughput of the platforms that are already in the network, and then also to invest heavily in their own compute infrastructure. That doesn't necessarily mean that these operators are getting into compute as a service or GPU as a service. Some might, but others just know that they have to have these capabilities resident in their networks in order to support the growth of AI and the consumption of that traffic by both residential customers as well as enterprise customers. So with that said, with this environment of being very cautious and judicious about how you spend your money, how that translates into which PON technologies are purchased, you can see here that we're still in this major upgrade cycle from GPON, and then in China to XG-PON, which is asymmetric 10 gig, which has been underway for some time, and still throughout North America to XGS-PON, and that is really also now taking shape in Western European markets as well. So through the end of this decade, we are really seeing a heavy focus in the North American market and the Western European market on this upgrade to XGS-PON and the symmetric 10 gig speeds that can provide. Cumulatively, those two technologies, the 10 gig technologies, will account for roughly 70% of cumulative shipments from 2026 to 2030. And I mentioned the 50 gig PON. We are starting to see that now beginning to ramp in small numbers, and it's beginning really next year. We'll see the Chinese operators begin to invest heavily. Obviously, there's subsidization that goes on in that market that certainly helps the purchasing power on behalf of the operators. But we're going to see 50 gig then translate into new markets as well, particularly here in North America and then pockets of Western Europe and the Middle East as well. On the ONT side, we have an interesting dynamic where we're still seeing a lot of GPON ONTs being purchased on a global basis. China again skews these numbers because they are deploying what's called fiber to the room for residential customers, where they'll run fiber along the baseboards, fiber along doorways into individual rooms, and then drop an ONT or an ONT gateway, Wi-Fi gateway, into those rooms to, again, improve performance, to reduce Wi-Fi channel contention issues. And that's still an application where, in fact, those units in China that are being purchased right now for fiber to the room account for roughly 80% of all ONT shipments in China. So it's an incredibly important application and use case for the operators in that market. Elsewhere, of course, here in the North American market, again, with the XGS-PON OLT infrastructure that's been put in place, we're starting to see a ramp now as prices have come down for the XGS-PON ONTs. One thing that we're watching very closely, of course, is the additional costs that vendors are going to have to bear for memory, DDR4, even DDR3 now, as vendors try and deal with supply issues, again, coming from data center demand and AI demand for memory. They just can't keep up with the demand. And so that's having an impact on the bill of materials costs for these ONTs, let alone for Wi-Fi gateways and residential gateways in the home. So we're watching that very closely as to seeing as how those additional costs get passed down to operators, or whether the vendors absorb. There's likely to be some compromise scenarios there as to how that works out. Now, Gary mentioned at the outset how fiber is expanding, it's throughout the data center into all new use cases. And for me, covering residential technologies, I can absolutely confirm that. And what we're seeing now is that PON technologies are also following the use or the deployment of fiber throughout data centers, as well as in enterprises. And we are hearing time and again that enterprises, because of what they expect in terms of AI demand and what the capacity requirements of their employees at their desktops, that many enterprises are now beginning to overbuild their offices with fiber, or purchasing obviously new facilities that are native with fiber as well. So we're beginning to cover, and we'll be publishing a report here shortly that covers both PON and enterprise applications. So there are two primary ones: fiber to the room for business, which is mostly sold by the operators, and that's mostly for the Chinese market, and then optical LAN, which is a use case that we've heard for many years now, but it's finally really coming to fruition beyond kind of military and government applications now to more private enterprises and VARs and that have typically been Ethernet switch resellers to enterprises are now looking at optical LAN in significant volumes. And of course, PON in the data center is a new use case where PON is being used for the out-of-band management. Obviously, a point-to-multipoint architecture in those scenarios really becomes useful if you're trying to manage the fiber that you have deployed, especially if you're, with all the demand that's coming from fiber, as Gary mentioned, everything dovetailing right now between fiber broadband and data center use cases. There may be applications or times when you're short on the availability of fiber, so out-of-band management helps to mitigate those issues, as well as also to simplify the cabling infrastructure issues that many hyperscalers are beginning to face. And the same is true for infrastructure management. Let's not forget that in these data centers, there are dozens and hundreds of cameras and smart locks and all the things that protect the security of these really expensive switches that have GPUs. And so we're starting to see this data center infrastructure management as another use case for PON and fiber in the data center. So we're watching this very closely, and we'll be publishing a 5-year forecast coming up here shortly. Okay, so spent a lot of time talking about fiber. I generally come on to Fiber for Breakfast and provide some background on what cable operators are doing as well, just to give a sense for some context on the terrestrial side. And the cable market is certainly an interesting one. Here in this particular slide, I don't have a legend, but the purple block there is for vCMTS licenses and revenue associated with those virtual CMTS licenses, and then green is for the primarily for remote PHY devices. There are also still some remote MAC-PHY devices. So these are all for DOCSIS-based deployments. You can see that 2025, with the introduction of the Broadcom unified chipset, and so vendors were integrating those into their existing product lines, also updating the RF trays on the RPDs for DOCSIS 4.0. 2025 was a significant pause year for major purchases. And with 2026, we are now seeing that ramp up as Charter and Comcast and other cable operators really start to ramp up their purchasing of these devices to expand their DOCSIS capabilities. Also, not only to get closer to DOCSIS 4.0 or even 3.1 plus, but also to implement low latency DOCSIS. So going back to what I talked about in the beginning about latency being an important differentiator, the cable operators know that, and they're implementing the technologies that reduce latency within their DOCSIS networks as well, in addition to improving the reliability. So it's not that they're standing idly by and saying, look, we can't do anything with this DOCSIS infrastructure, this HFC infrastructure. They're making the most of it as they can. For smaller cable operators, what we hear consistently is a strategy of cap and grow, right? Where they will upgrade their DOCSIS infrastructure now to get to a level like perhaps with DOCSIS 3.1 plus and maybe implementing low latency DOCSIS, which keeps them competitive. But then that's it. Then the next step for them is moving to fiber. And we are starting to see that really, in addition, through the purchases of remote OLT platforms, right, which are smaller form factor, node-based platforms. Charter really started off with these platforms through their RDOF bids and RDOF build-outs, and we're seeing more and more cable operators begin to use this platform as a way to now, on a piecemeal basis, begin to upgrade their networks as they as they do greenfield fiber build-outs, as well as do overbuilding for their newer fiber networks. And you can see, obviously in the last BEAD round, we did see that Comcast and Charter, which weren't significant players in the initial BEAD funding round, are now a larger portion of that. And my expectation is that remote OLTs will be a good portion of those edge-out projects. In addition to that, it's important to note that roughly 2 to 3% every year of HFC, of the hybrid fiber coax network, is swapped for fiber every year. So this has been ongoing. And in some cases, I've heard anecdotally that some operators want to push that to 5% if they can. And this is really due to, when you get to coax being just too old, right? Or you haven't upgraded it in some time. Maybe you're still at DOCSIS 3.0, and the cost to put out new amplifiers, 1.8 amplifiers, for example, to support extended spectrum DOCSIS would be too costly. So then it becomes almost an apples to apples of whether you deploy fiber at that point. So that's happening, and it has been happening, and it's going to continue to happen on an ongoing basis. One market where it's happening in significant volumes is in Latin America, where obviously labor costs are lower, and just the die has already been cast among cable operators for overbuilding their HFC plant with fiber. And they're using remote OLTs because they can put battery backup into those platforms, into those nodes. And as you know, power disruptions are frequent in many Latin American markets. So to be able to have a remote powering system in those nodes is almost a necessity. And one thing that we're also seeing before I hand things back is, Charter and Comcast kind of have dominated using 10 gig EPON, but we're starting to see this shift over to XGS-PON as well. Cable operators, again, aren't going to stick on this path if where the ITU and other technologies suggest that XGS-PON should lead to 25 gig PON or 50 gig PON and beyond. So those are the technologies that are now being introduced more frequently into these remote OLT platforms, and we'll see that transition continue to happen. So Gary, I'll hand things back to you.
Well, always fantastic information, Jeff. Let me start with, since you're talking about cable, we're entering the market consolidation phase, right? We've already seen T-Mobile picking up handfuls of operators at a time, and everybody's kind of getting positioned for the music to stop, and we have 1,561 fiber operators. So if cable wants to participate in this market consolidation phase, don't they have to start aligning their networks so that you integrate easier and be able to fit the model as these networks start to converge?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think in some cases the discussions are now going, and you can see this in some of the discussions about what comes after 1.8 gigahertz in the outside plant. Is it 3 gigahertz? Is it 6 gigahertz? Right, with DOCSIS 4.0 Annex A. Those technologies, right, when you get to 3 gigahertz, part of the rationale of extending the HFC plant to support that is to have CBRS traffic run over that. So if you're looking at the potential consolidation with the T-Mobile, for example, that makes perfect sense. The other thing is to keep in mind is that with a virtual CMTS, we're talking about a server-based, software-based, virtualized platform, right? And that platform can take on the functions of a mobile core potentially, and in addition to a BNG. So when it comes to the management of subscribers and customers at the core, you're already putting in place the software infrastructure and the compute infrastructure to make that happen. I know you want me to answer with yes, they need to roll out more fiber in order to align their networks at the physical layer, and that's important too. They need to have a plan for that, but CapEx, cable operators have never operated in that environment. They've always been modest spenders where they can and incremental upgraders. So, as long as I think if you can prove that the back end core in terms of subscriber management and then the physical layer at the access network provides you with a pathway of a CapEx efficient pathway to align the networks at the physical layer, then I think certainly ripe for consolidation, definitely.
Yeah, and basically there's only two cable guys left, right? Everybody else is fiber to the home guys. So, and I would assume Charter and Comcast would be the guys that are the acquirers rather than being acquired, possibly. You didn't really, I know on your purview is Wi-Fi. I want to get into fiber to the room. So as we're going to, we already have 10 gig networks, 25 gig PON, 50 gig coming up. What I found out, in my personal 10 gig scenarios, my Wi-Fi can't keep up. So I have to do fiber to the desktop. Do you think that fiber to the room will now be a very, as people start going beyond just getting, I think what we saw in the Open Vault data was really, there's only two tiers left. You either price sensitive and get the 200 to 400 meg tier, or you get as much bandwidth as you possibly can buy. And those guys like me, that's going to take as much bandwidth as you can buy, you need fiber to your desktop. Is that what we're going to see?
Oh yeah, I definitely think it's going to surprise as a use case in markets that currently don't really seem realistic for it. Talking about the North American market in particular, I do think it will be an option, and I think builders, it's really up to them in terms of new housing when they begin to incorporate that architecture, and I think those discussions are going on now. It's going to take some time, certainly, but again, like you said, the bandwidth demands at the high end, again, we don't know exactly what the impact will be from AI, but you have to assume that all the smart devices in the home today will be amplified in some capacity, and Wi-Fi 7 has a theoretical maximum capacity, but again, the distance sensitivity as you get higher and higher in the frequency becomes really difficult to manage. No matter whether you go to Wi-Fi 8 or even higher, it's just a physics issue, issue that can be solved with fiber in individual rooms. So.
Yeah, before we run out of time, I want to get in, Paul had a couple good questions here, but can you talk about likely use cases for multi-gig upstream?
Oh boy, yeah. I think the multi-gig upstream is, that's something that we don't see the applications demanding it yet, but if you project into the future, and it's interesting to look historically, right? And we talked with the Open Vault team that the downstream CAGR for consumption has started to moderate. The upstream CAGR has not by any stretch. And the more upstream capacity that you give to your customers, the more they're going to find ways to use it. And if you admit as an operator that latency is going to be a huge differentiator, then you want to have symmetric multi-gig available to your customers that want it, regardless of whether the applications are there. People have always been willing to pay for bandwidth, even if the applications aren't bandwidth intense anymore. So it always starts that way, and then the price curves come down, and people find a way to fill up that capacity.
Well, speaking of filling up, the NVIDIA, I mean, these guys with endless checkbooks never cease to amaze me, but their partnership with Pulte Homes to start putting GPU racks in people's basements, are we seeing inferencing that's literally going to be in homes now? I mean, so latency is definitely going to be king.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And I mean, whether that comes to fruition or not, the edge data center at the home, there's no question that inferencing is being pushed as close to subscribers as possible. It may not be in their yard, but it is going to be in their neighborhood. It is going to be as close as possible, because there's really no better way to reduce latency than proximity. And that is, that's just one of many use cases, I think, that are going to come up, that are going, the focus of which is going to be how to reduce latency and increase the performance of inferencing.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much. I'm just amazed every day. It's just new, interesting stuff happening in our industry, and it's accelerating at a pace I've never seen before. So I think we'll both be very busy for many years to come. So
definitely.
So thanks for joining us. We appreciate your research and all your expertise, and look to see your reports, especially on AI infrastructure and quantum infrastructure and all the things that are going to be heavily needing lots of fiber and low latency and high capacity.
Thank you.
I hope you guys will join me again next Wednesday. We're going to have Ron Westfall, the Vice President and Practice Leader of Infrastructure and Networking for Hyperframe Research. He's going to discuss his research lens, the state of enterprise AI stack, their second half 2026 report. So Ron is so good that he's going to have his whole second half report ready for us by next week. Jeff, you're going to have to get up with it, get your second half stuff done.
You said we're going to be busy.
All right. Well, thanks again, Jeff, and everyone. Thanks for joining us.